This is Advisorpedia's Power Your Advice podcast, and I'm Doug Heikkinen. Today, we welcome Douglas Ferguson to the podcast. Douglas is the president of Voltage Control. And today, he's going to talk about a really interesting topic, collaborative leadership and building high-performance advisory teams. Welcome to the podcast, Douglas.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Before we get into the topic, can you tell us a little bit about Voltage Control and what you guys do there?
Yeah, happy to. We are a facilitation academy, which means that we train people on how to be collaborative leaders and to drive more productivity and effective collaboration across an organization. I think it's a really critical leadership skill.
So let's get into the topic. Financial advisors. What are some of the overlooked facilitation skills that financial advisors should learn to effectively manage and motivate their teams?
The thing I always tell folks is that, when you're in a leadership position and working with teams or groups or organizations of all sorts, it's really important to make sure that we are getting the best out of everyone. And as a leader, it's really exhausting to bring all the answers. And so facilitation skills are about how we draw the answers out of people and help them become stronger and more motivated to be creative, to think about innovative solutions. And so it's a really important skill to hone and craft, especially if we're working with teams and trying to get more out of the groups we're working with.
How can advisory firms use facilitation techniques to intentionally build their internal culture, especially when rapidly integrating new advisors and new team members?
Yeah, there's a lot of techniques. One of the things we talk a lot about in facilitation is this idea of connection before content. And so when you're integrating new members into the team, we certainly want them to be knowledgeable about the information, about the policies and procedures, but we also have to build a cohesive, highly connected organization. And so, making sure we dedicate time and energy into fostering those relationships will then create dividends long term. So, this idea of we might need to move a little slow right now so we can move faster later. And I think a lot of times folks miss out on this idea of let's build the bedrock of a solid team and make sure that people are supporting each other and in as many ways as possible. And so connection for content's a powerful one. Also, just thinking about the tools that are going to best serve us for what we're trying to accomplish right now. And oftentimes folks will, default to kind of the way we've always run a meeting or the way we always gathered. And instead, if we're more intentional about being clear on the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish, what are the ideal outcomes for right now, and then tailor fitting those tools in will generally create better results. So an example would be, are we trying to make a decision? And so let's be really clear on the fact that we're going to make a decision together and how we're going to even approach that decision. I think oftentimes folks will default into, let's just throw a meeting on the calendar. I'm hoping to get some information so I can make a decision. That wasn't clear to everyone. People walk out kind of disgruntled because they were like, well, why did we meet if they were going to ignore all my advice and go make the decision? And so the thing is setting those expectations up front so that we know what we're trying to accomplish and we're using the right tool for the job, because there's a whole arsenal of facilitation tools, but how do we ensure we're picking the right one that's going to serve the purpose that we intend?
Are you finding that advisory teams struggle with collaboration? And if so, how can
Mhm.
leaders proactively address these challenges?
I think lots of folks struggle with collaboration if it's not something we're focused on. Oftentimes, I'll see folks assume that collaboration is a natural outcome when you just throw people in a room or put people together in some sort of format. Like, oh, I assembled this team, they're going to collaborate. Well, that's not always the case. And I always tell people to consider a gardening metaphor. We can't force a garden to grow. If we leave it unattended, it's not necessarily going to grow in ways that are most productive or as bountiful as it could be. And so our job as leaders or gardeners of these teams is to set the conditions where they're going to thrive. How are we making sure they have the right amount of water, the right around the sun, they're protected in the right ways, but they're also free to expand and grow as needed. And so I think that's the biggest challenge is just assuming that it's a natural byproduct of humans being together and not taking the time to set the conditions for it to flourish and or take root.
In your experience, what's the difference between an advisory team that's merely functional and one that's really high performing, cohesive, and innovative?
Well, maybe that last word is really the differentiator, right? A team that's cohesive, working together, they're going to be more innovative. They're going to come up with clever solutions. They're going to create well, they're gonna solve problems that maybe we even thought weren't even possible to solve. They're gonna be offering unique solutions and drive outcomes for folks, when there's a new challenge in the market or just even the way, whether that's financial markets or even just the fickle markets that exist because of the way humans behave, right? Then, that stuff can change regularly, and we need to be able to respond to that. We need to be agile to those movements and shifts and perception and behaviors. And when you have a team that's collaborative and curious and supporting each other, they're going to surface some of those realizations and some of those ideas, support each other, and then ultimately they're going to arrive at much better outcomes, much better results. And so I think that's what innovation is really about, right? It's about observing, staying curious, and then experimenting toward better and better ways to solve the problems that are emerging versus just getting into a process or a procedure and running it and checking in and checking out and going home. I think when you have a collaborative, curious, supportive team, you start to see lots of novel ideas start to surface that really can move the business in ways that it's hard to even predict until it starts happening, right? The stuff's like nascent and there, but unless you take the time to allow it to expose itself, those benefits aren't always clear. And it's also hard to predict sometimes, right? Like sometimes it's surprisingly simple when some of these things emerge and it's like, oh wow, that's gonna either make things smoother or less of a headache, less risky, or it's gonna improve direct revenue outcomes because we're creating better outcomes for our clients and customers, or we're selling more packages just because we're more efficient or we're more, I would say, competitive in the things that we're offering.
Advisory firms regularly face uncertainty. Now more than ever, that's incredibly evident. Market volatility, regulatory shifts, client anxiety. How can a facilitative leadership approach help teams thrive during such periods of this complexity?
Yeah, I would say probably the best approach to addressing uncertainty is taking a facilitative approach because, when we're looking at uncertainty, we're having to make decisions with limited information. We're having to have an opinion or even consider outcomes that are hard to even reason about or predict. And there, not only is it powerful to bring a group together and to have a orchestrated exploration of these topics and these unknowable things, because that can settle the nerves to begin with, right? Because if let's, for example, if you're a type of leader that is thinking, "Gosh, I got to have all the answers. I got to figure this out. I got to come strong with an opinion and with a direction." When you're faced with uncertainty and unknowability, that is anxiety provoking. Because how do you show up with that very solid, very crisp direction and opinion if that those are the circumstances? Whereas if you've created an environment that's more collaborative, more curious, more open, then we can explore that stuff together and it doesn't just rest on someone else's shoulders. Because at the end of the day, even if you're the type of leader that's bringing the direction and the answers, you haven't hired idiots. And so they see these signals, they know the uncertainty, they feel it too, but they are now powerless and just watching you try to make all decisions and point toward where things need to go. And so if we create a space that's more open, curious, collaborative, then now we're sharing that exploration and that conversation, and we're more likely to get it right because now we're bringing a diverse perspective, lots of different ideas, lots of vantage points, lots of knowledge to the table to try and solve the problem. Not only does a mindset have a huge impact, but there's also lots of facilitation tools that are specifically designed for exploring, strategic planning and kind of unknowable futures. In fact, there's a body of work called futures design, speculative design, and even just lots of strategic planning, strategic foresight. There are lots of these tools and techniques that you can draw from to explore those kinds of situations. Probably my favorite is one called critical uncertainties. Have you heard of that one?
I haven't.
So critical uncertainties is a great activity for exploring these kind of unknowable solutions that are critical and kind of making them a bit more concrete. And so we're going to use a 2x2, and one axis is going to be one critical thing that will have a big impact on your business, but is unknowable. And the other axis will be yet another item that's critical to the business or to your outcomes and is unknowable. And we can maybe predict how it might transpire. Usually we're looking at a continuum, like interest rates are going to like go down by a lot or they're going to go up by a lot. And so we can kind of like look at across that and say, all right, they might go up, they might go down, by how much. And then on the other axis, we might look at, people are going to retire at an earlier age versus they're going to retire at a younger age. And so we look at those different quadrants and say, all right, well, if they retire at a younger age and interest rates are higher, how might we respond to that? If they are, retiring at a older age with lower interest rates, how might we respond to that? And so in each quadrant, you're thinking about the strategies of this potential future that we're going to explore. And then one thing that I really like is once you've done that, and you could even have different members of the team tackle different quadrants and then come back together and discuss like, hey, how might we critique or debrief what showed up in each quadrant? Like what's missing? What are we thinking? It really can invite some smaller group work plus some bigger group conversation. And then after that, after you really exhausted a lot of conversation around these potential futures, you could introduce other axes and start to think about other different versions and combinations. But also when we look across our strategies, which things maybe work across all quadrants? What are the similarities between the things that we're doing in all four? Or if we're done multiple 2x2s, maybe all 8 or all 10. And those are your hedging strategies. And they're going to serve you well regardless of what happens. And so what might seem at first like a really daunting decision or a lot of messy stuff to wade through can now seem very simple and obvious. It's like, well, we don't know what's going to happen, but clearly after doing a bit of analysis and conversation, we know that these two hedging strategies are really good for us right now, and we should do those no matter what.
Let's change gears here and talk about innovation and design thinking in financial advisories, which is a topic that you don't think about when you think about financial advisor firms. So how can innovation and design thinking principles practically apply within advisory practices to strengthen client relationships and outcomes?
Yeah, design thinking is certainly a technique that was um, born out of product design and even I would argue service design to some degree. But we see people using it in all sorts of ways. Even there's classes at Stanford that talk about design your life. So how are we using these skills to think about creating the ideal, day-to-day life that we might live? I've seen people use these techniques with their band to write better music. At the end of the day, these are rooted in solid design philosophy and our way of ensuring that we're bringing great design technique and design mindsets into the work that we're creating, into the outputs that we're generating. And so if we think about design from that perspective, like anything can be designed. I can design the best day possible. I can design a great vacation. I can design, you know, anything. I can design my wardrobe, right? It's like how we put stuff together, how we manifest it, how we create is ultimately design. And so if we're starting to apply these techniques toward anything we're creating, it can really unlock a lot of potential that might have been hidden. And I think the number one thing for folks, because there's a lot of hype out there, and you read things, and a lot of times the tools and techniques get um, put center because they might have fun names, they might sound interesting, but I think a lot of well, it just creates a lot of noise, and it's hard to understand, well, what's the real purpose of this stuff? And at the end of the day, it's about bringing design principles and design concepts into how we approach our problems. And one of the most important ones is um, separating the problem definition from the solutioning. Quite oftentimes when we in business settings or even people are doing this in product things that felt very designed, people were even doing it wrong there, which was they were jumping to solutions too fast. They were getting into the actual articulation of what it is and the components and the capabilities and the nature of how it would function. And so if we spend more time up front defining, well, what problem are we trying to solve, or what opportunity are we starting, or are we attempting to tap into? We get really clear on that, and make sure we bring the whole group to in focus on that clarity that we've are starting to align on. Then we're going to create much better outcomes. Quite often we'll see teams, no matter what they're working on, if it's a product, if it's a marketing campaign, if it's a new service or a new solution, or even some way that we're gonna work together. Like, what is our policy for how we're handling asynchronous work? Well, if we just jump straight into our policy and what are the parameters of it and how's it going to function, we really miss the opportunity to find some novel solutions because we haven't really articulated the problem or the opportunity in front of us. So the better that we can do that and spend time getting to that clarity, we might get to an aha moment. The other thing I would say about design thinking, because it's a co-creation and collaborative process quite often, is that we can move past decisions that are purely based on options, where it's like, oh, here is Tori's idea, and here's Doug's idea, and here's Susan's idea. Which of these three are we going to pick? And instead, design thinking and collaborative or facilitative approaches are looking at how we might integrate them, or how, looking at all three of these, what new ideas does that generate that's like even better than all three of them. So it's kind of moving away from options, moving away from being so fixated on the solution and the outcome too quickly, so that we can really uncover nascent and novel ideas.
You wrote a book called Beyond the Prototype. How does prototyping in iteration translate into financial advisory context?
Mm.
Maybe share an example of a simple prototype advisors could use in client engagements?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a big believer that prototypes are one of the most powerful things we can use in a business. And at Voltage Control, we prototype everything. And here's a great way to think about it. If you remember in school, when we were going to write a paper, the first step in writing the paper was to write an outline. So that outline is a prototype of your paper. And I would say that anytime that this early draft, kind of outline-ish straw person version of the thing that you're trying to create, anytime that can resemble the end state as closely as possible, the better. So your prototype is an idea, a way of getting your idea across that's concrete and very explicit. And so the issue is that a lot of times when we're trying to convey our ideas and we're just using words, it can, and definitely when we're just using conversation, it can leave a lot to be misunderstood. And so the more clear and visual we make our prototypes, the less ambiguity we have. And so the more clarity and less ambiguity we have, the more the team's understanding each other, and then the more they can say yes and your idea. Because if they see it, here's a great example. We were doing some work with Fidelity, and they were planning a big project, and everyone was on board. I mean, this was a board level decision to push this initiative, and they've been working on it for months and months and months. And through some facilitated workshops, the team developed a prototype, and the team was really like excited because they felt that it was like everything they'd imagined and then some, because they were able to refine it together. It got really crystal clear, really obvious. And they're like, yeah, this is exactly what we want to build. This is our vision. And we feel even more aligned now that we've been able to make some iterations and whatnot. They took that prototype to some leadership meetings, and there was this uncanny thing where some of the responses were, "Oh, that's what you're planning on building?" And so, they were finally at a point where these other leaders in the organization got it, right? Because we're not just using slogans and a jargon or just categorical descriptions. We're getting to something that's really concrete and demonstrating what we're trying to manifest. And so we have a mantra here at Voltage Control, which is no prototype, no meeting. And so we always bring prototypes to everything that we work on, with the idea being that with some early version of the thing we're trying to create, we can have way more clarity on what it is. We can have a lot more momentum build up because now everyone's reacting to this potential thing that we're trying to make versus this like more abstract or conceptual description. And then you want to take that to another level as you have multiple people or everyone make prototypes. Maybe they all make different versions, and then we're comparing what one person made versus the other. Really, really quite powerful way to move the needle. And I would just say that it can be challenging to to find opportunities at first, but once you start doing it and practicing it, you can realize that anything can be a prototype. If I'm going to do a pitch deck or a presentation, let's say that we want to start explaining our services a little bit different to clients. Then we might make a new draft of our pitch deck or our one pager. That can be we can make an early prototype of that and have the team start marking it up and redlining it and thinking about, oh, what else might we do? If we want to reimagine how we would have an encounter with a client, we might prototype that through an updated script. And we might even do some role playing and let others observe this new script that we're prototyping together. And then the beautiful thing is in creating these prototypes and adopting this prototype mindset, then we start to lean into all of our work as if they're prototypes and that everything is malleable and we can update anything at any time and we can always learn from any encounter or anything we're working on. So, and that's really powerful because once you decide something's written in stone and it's a policy forever, that's when innovation tends to die.
Last thing I want to talk about today is improving client conversations and getting your views on that. What can advisors learn from facilitation experts like you about conducting conversations that uncover the deeper values, motivations, and the concerns of their clients?
I think there's a few things. One is it's all about questions and prompts. The more we can ask good questions that really get people into storytelling mode. So, for instance, a great way to think about, in fact, there's a really great book called The Beautiful Book of Questions. Um, and it is, I mean, that really distills down some great elements of questions. It's worth checking out. And um, the thing I'll say is to think about your questions and how they put the client in this mindset of storytelling. So, for instance, if you were to say, um, "Tell me about your, tell me about the what it was like starting your job," versus "What is your job like?" So, the first version put them in a time and place in a memory. So now they're reliving and recounting those moments. So anytime you can put someone in a time and a place and ask them to remember and share with you what that was like. A classic one is, you know, if you ask someone what their onboarding process is like at their company, either you start getting this very robotic, very like detailed, like here are the components of our onboarding plan and policy. But, if you ask them, tell me about when you were onboarded, or tell me about the last employee that you onboarded into the program. What did that feel like? And so I just encourage people to ask questions that are really open-ended and, avoid yes, no questions, and really get people into the storytelling mindset of like, how can we get really curious, put them in a moment in time so that they really start to share the details and things get unfold. Also, I'd say with prototypes, if we take that mindset and bring it into the client encounters, anytime we can visualize something, share our screen, get folks to react to something. Now we have this kind of shared visual moment. I'm a big fan of visual note taking. And so if you're good at doodling and drawing, then, grabbing some tool or app that allows you to do that and share your screen, or if you're in person with someone, just draw these sketches and these things out on paper. Super powerful way to connect with someone and help them more deeply understand. And then that might draw out more detail as well because now they're reacting to some visual. And if you can't draw or that's not a skill that you're developing, even just like live note taking and organizing. I'm a big fan of Miro, which is a collaboration tool. It's like a virtual whiteboard. I used to use whiteboards extensively when we were in person, just getting up there and sometimes just writing words down that you're hearing people say and then coming back to them. Because if you write something down and they can see you wrote it down, then they know that you've taken interest in that. And without you even prompting, they might go and elaborate and say more about that. And it just speeds up the discovery because you're not having to stop and then ask another question and get them back in the mindset. And so, what are these visual ways that you might get them even more engaged and thinking more deeply about where the conversation might go, or what details there might be that might help out the discovery process?
There's so much more here that we could dig into to get your expertise to help advisors. But let me ask you this last question. What's been the feedback that you've gotten from financial advisor teams that you've been working with when you go through this process with them? And what's the results been?
Mm. Well, the typical feedback is, "Where has this been all my life? I wish I would have like been using these skills more frequently and definitely." Because it's interesting. Some folks will say, "This is really familiar. I've seen this before. I've even intuitively done a little bit of this." But the vocabulary is so powerful to have and be able to reference and share with each other about like, "Oh, I'm doing this technique," or I'm leaning into some clarity around purpose. I'm leaning into some some better prompting. And so just having a little bit of shared language about how to discuss and talk about these things so that it is a craft and a skill that we're working on. I think that's really illuminating for people. And I hear that a ton from advisors and other clients around, this is making a difference to put a focus on refining this stuff and how I bring folks together and how I work with clients differently and bring a bit more curiosity. And then as far as the outcomes, I think ultimately there's more clarity, there's better alignment on, where things need to go. So like whether we're developing a package or a solution for someone that it's going to be more aligned with their needs. And or if it's not a good fit, we can part ways much sooner. And so I think ultimately you can really draw some lines toward productivity, as well as, better performance.
There is a lot here, and I can see how it can help teams of all different sizes to communicate better internally and with their clients. Douglas, very interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us.
So it was my pleasure.
To learn more about voltage control, please visit voltagecontrol.com. We are on all social media platforms at Advisorpedia. Please give us a follow. For our producer, Tori Miller, and everyone at Advisorpedia, thank you so much for listening.